recross for Mr. Robinette.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And then next we come to staff.
No questions.
Thank you, and it's fine.
No questions.
And that leads us to redirect Mr. Kleiser.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let's go in reverse order and start with the bench questions. So you were asked briefly about the staff approach and the rates in Appendix 3. Let's break that down into two different parts. Let's start with the staff approach. What was staff's approach for coming up with the actual depreciation rate that recommended, as you understand it?
Based on testimony and my understanding, staff utilized files provided by the company and arrived at very similar rates that were recommended by the company. The one main difference, in my opinion, based on the statement of positions now, is the general plant accounts, where staff recommended a total account rate that is present in Mr. Spanos' study. But Mr. Spanos is not actually recommending his total account rate.
What is Mr. Spanos recommending, as you understand it?
He is recommending a treatment of 0% depreciation rates for all fully accrued, and then a solid rate based on the lives that are similar to what staff has recommended in their study, be applied to everything that is unfully amortized.
Between the staff method and Mr. Spanos' method, which do you think is more accurate, or what flaws do you see?
I wouldn't recommend either because I'm hesitant to recommend a 0% depreciation rate on continuing assets. I would recommend Mr. Spanos' unamortized balance only for the accounts.
What about the accounts that have a different service life as proposed by staff?
Generally, I'd be supportive of staff with the exceptions to mains for cast iron and plastic.
So you would agree to using the service life and net salvage values in staff's Appendix 3?
Yes.
But if you apply the service life and net salvage values to the equation, which is found on page 112 of staff's cost of service, which I will provide you if you do not have a copy of in front of you. Will you get the rates that are in staff's Appendix 3? And there was a long pause in that question, so I can repeat it if necessary.
I believe the main issues are going to happen down in general plant, where they would not be because of the weighting that staff performed.
So if you use...
I'm sorry, because of what?
The weighting
Well,
method,
Thank you.
So if you used the staff average service life and net salvage from their Appendix 3 and applied the equation on page 112 of their cost of service, you would reach a solid depreciation rate that is similar to what Mr. Spanos...
I'm going to object to this line of questioning. It's beyond the scope of redirect.
I'm attempting to clarify what exactly staff's approach is, which admittedly is a bit confusing there. But I'll move on. So the other half of this was the general plan amortization, which you mentioned. Just briefly explain what general plan amortization is and why you have a problem with it.
general plant amortization is usually applied to the general plant accounts where it is a bunch of smaller assets that aren't readily tracked by the utilities. And what it ultimately could allow for is that you basically just have to take the total additions for the year and keep track of that, because that's really what you're tracking is additions for the year and making sure that they recover that value over the amortization period. You lose potentially the value of individual assets and tracking to say, are these still reasonable costs for the assets that they're adding?
Can you use staff's rates, or Mr. Spanos' rates for that matter, without ordering general plan amortization?
Objection again, this is beyond the scope of redirect.
Let me refer to my questions. I asked if OPC agreed with the approach used by staff.
To which Mr. Robinette responded that he did, but for the general plan amortization, which I'm attempting to explain what that answer meant.
I think we're fine. Overruled. Go ahead, Mr. Gleiser.
Do you need me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Can you use the rates recommended by staff and not order general plan amortization?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to move on. Let's talk about cast iron. Spire appears to be of the position or assumption that you're not recommending a change to cast iron. Are you recommending the commission order an adjustment to cast iron mains?
The depreciation rate change, yes.
Is your adjustment designed to make sure that Spire recovers the outstanding balance of cast iron main plant by the end of the, I know 2030 has been thrown around, but I'm going to say the ISRIT sunset provision?
Yes, if you look at my testimony on page 4 of my direct, I spell out the math. I'm actually recommending a depreciation rate that's almost 3 times what the company did.
Is Mr. Spanos' recommendation going to recover all of the outstanding cast iron plant by the end of the ISRIT sunset provision period?
I don't know. Mine accounts for not only the original cost, but cost of removal with an 8-year life.
All right. You were asked some questions regarding Spire East versus Spire West. Now, you're recommending Spire East.
Mr. Gleiser, I'm going to raise a problem here. I understood that we were doing redirect, and that was limited to bench questions, and I was the only one. Is that correct?
Wait, does not redirect also?
It covers also cross.
Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay, you scared me for a minute. Okay, you were asked several questions about the difference between Spire East and Spire West. So again, just so we know where we're starting, you're recommending Spire East be applied to both, right?
Yes.
What were your problems with the Spire West data?
Historically, there's been an issue with the data dating back to an original transfer that lost part of it. With that, I believe there was probably creation of additional data to age it that may exist. But basically, you have data from 94 forward that could be used.
But your recommendation is if you want to use the best data, just use Spire East.
I was more comfortable with Spire East historical data, yes.
So you were asked several questions about conducting a site visit or speaking with company personnel. Do you feel it's necessary to conduct a site visit to do a depreciation study or recommend depreciation rates?
Generally, it's helpful. I don't know that it's entirely necessary all the time, depending on your familiarity with the utility.
Did Spire offer personnel to have conversations with OPC recommending its rates?
I didn't ask for it, but I would assume that they would have allowed that.
I don't think I have any other redirects.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. I believe that does it for our witness, Ms. Robinette. You are excused. And it is 4:50. I'm just stating that for everyone's information. I had brought up the issue of possibly going late this week and possibly going late this evening. I'm going to start with a question and maybe ease ourselves into this. If we stopped now, what is the schedule for the rest of the week? My concern being capital overheads, which is scheduled for today. Are we just going to bump that to tomorrow morning? Also, Mr. Kleiser, before we make decisions, I recall that you had a scheduling concern that you wanted to bring up.
My concern was that I have a person who was previously scheduled to discuss on the WNAR RNA issue, which, given that it's the third thing on Wednesday, would most likely fall in the afternoon. She has a doctor's appointment in the afternoon. I'd like to push it to the top of the day.
Staff has no objection to that.
Fire doesn't object, Your Honor.
Granted.
If I assume that there's limited cross from the other interveners on the issue of capitalization of overheads, which seems likely given the current state of the hearing, I do not have much cross of capitalization of overheads.
Neither do I.
And the company is willing to proceed this evening on the issue.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
And so the company is willing to proceed this evening on the issue of capitalization of overhead.
Okay, seeing no objections, we're going to proceed to our next issue. That is capital overheads. Let me see who I have on my witness list. Crick.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Crick, please come on up to our witness stand.
I
And
believe we have many opening statements.
Mr. Crick, if you could please hold on, we'll have many opening statements first. I appreciate first my. Okay, let's keep with the same order. Spire for opening our mini opening statements, and this is concerning capital overheads. Mr. Cooper, at your convenience.
Thank you, Your Honor. I guess for the court reporter, this is Dean Cooper, appearing on behalf of Spire, Missouri. Your Honor, Spire, Missouri calculates its overhead capitalization rates in accordance with the Uniform System of Accounts, using a reasonable and acceptable approach that is consistent with its historical practice and charges overheads to capital that are reasonably applicable to its projects. The staff and OPC witnesses focus on those aspects of the USOA gas plant instruction 4B that discusses direct time assignments and special studies. However, what the USOA prohibits in the last sentence of USOA gas plant instruction 4B is the use of arbitrary percentages or amounts. Spire, Missouri capitalizes overheads using a systematic and consistent approach that primarily relies on cost causation factors to estimate the relationship of certain overhead costs to construction activities in lieu of studies. These factors are not fixed, but rather are updated monthly as level of construction activities vary throughout the year and the seasons. Spire, Missouri's process is based on reason and judgment and therefore is not arbitrary. Moreover, the general ledger contains transaction level support for these costs. No changes are necessary to the overhead capitalization amounts. The Commission's report and order in case number
GO-2019-0356, which was issued by the Commission on October 30th of 2019, similarly found that since Spire, Missouri allocated overhead costs consistently with how these costs were allocated in its last general rate cases, it did not add arbitrary percentages or amounts to its overhead costs. The Commission concludes that Spire, Missouri's treatment of overheads for purposes of these cases is allowable according to the USOA. Further, Section 4 of 20 CSR 4240-40.040 allows the Commission to vary from the USOA where appropriate. Spire, Missouri's process for assigning overheads to capital investments has not fundamentally changed since that time. However, we are here because in the referenced ISRIS case, the Commission further indicated that decisions varying from the methods in the general rate case are best handled during the course of a rate case when there is more time for a full examination and all rate factors are being reviewed. That opportunity has been provided in this case. However, the answer should be the same. Further, while it's acknowledged that consistency for consistency's sake is not a reason to do something, Spire's approach has provided stability for its customers and the company in terms of rate impacts over many years. Any restriction as to Spire's ability to capitalize overheads would necessitate a substantial increase to Spire's revenue requirement. This is because costs that are currently being allocated to capital and recovered over the life of those assets would instead be shifted to expense and recovered on an annual basis. As shown in the rebuttal testimony of company witness Timothy Crick, that could be an increase of as much as $15 million in the company's annual revenue requirement. This type of rate whiplash is neither good for customers nor the company. Now, having said this, if on a going forward basis, the Commission believes that a special study or studies are necessary, Spire is very much willing to conduct such studies to share those results with the parties and modify its procedures when rates are next set, if appropriate. As you mentioned earlier, Your Honor, Spire will provide the testimony today of Mr. Timothy Crick, who is the Vice President, Controller, and Chief Accounting Officer of Spire, Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Next on our order of opening is staff.
May it please the Commission, this is a straightforward issue. Staff attempted to audit the capitalized overheads and was unable to do so. Let me quote from the testimony of Mr. Young, staff's expert. In response to a data request asking for test year overhead employee costs and the related benefits that are capitalized, Spire stated it does not maintain records of such information. Furthermore, Spire states that the allocation of costs to capital orders has dozens of steps and is a complex systematic process. Consequently, staff cannot accurately discern the origin of overhead costs that Spire is booking to its capital projects and including in its rate base. Staff is unable to affirm that Spire is in compliance with USOA requirements found in Gas Plant Instructions 3 and 4. Consequently, and let me add that staff also is of the opinion that there are costs currently capitalized by Spire that appear to conflict with the guidance set forth in the USOA. Consequently, staff recommends that on a going forward basis, the Commission should order Spire to cease capitalizing non-operational overhead costs, or alternatively, order Spire to cease capitalizing costs received from Spire services until such time that Spire can demonstrate its compliance with the USOA. Spire cannot be audited. That is simply a circumstance that cannot be permitted to persist. It's staff's obligation as the investigatory arm of the commission to determine whether or not utility companies are complying with commission regulations. In this instance, staff is unable to do so. Thank you. Questions?
Excuse me, Judge, who was that for staff?
That was Kevin Thompson.
Thank you.
Following our list of openings, I believe Legal Services, Mr. Bars, you're next on our list. Did you have an opening for capital overheads?
I do not, and sorry to try and clarify what I said earlier, I will not have many opening statements on any other issues barring legal low-income issues scheduled for Friday.
Thank you, Mr. Bars. What about cross-examination? Should I keep asking you on cross too?
Not for this witness, thank you, on this issue, or on any witness for this issue.
Okay, thank you, sir. Then our next opening statement, Office of the Public Counsel. Sir.
Please the commission. I'm sure that's on and off. Regardless, I'll just project. No?
No, because we have WebEx, we have a court reporter.
Hey, is that? Nope.
Can I give you this one?
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
I'll try and move it over there, or I'm just gonna stand right here and do it, because this is not gonna take very long at all. Fortunately, I think staff's attorney has summed up the problems with this issue admirably. I have very little to add to it. As the excerpt that I handed out shows, the USOA prohibits assigning capitalizing overheads that based on arbitrary percentages. The company is using arbitrary percentages to allocate its overheads. I mean, there's really not a whole lot more to it than that, honestly. The company talks about providing a study. I would point out that the second full sentence says, where the procedure of using, time cards is practical, you shall provide a study, basically. They haven't already. They're already supposed to be doing what they're suggesting they might do if the commission wants them to. That's the whole problem here. They're using arbitrary percentages. They're clearly not allowed to. I second everything else that staff said, and I have nothing else really further to add.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. That will conclude our mini opening statements on the issue of capital overheads. Again, that is issue 15. We will go ahead and start with our witnesses. Witness Crick, K-R-I-C-K. Could you please come up to the witness stand? Thank you, sir. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Please take your seat, and would you state and spell your name for the court reporter?
Yeah, Timothy Crick, K-R-I-C-K.
And Spire's witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Crick, by whom are you employed?
Excuse me, I need to know who's asking the questions.
My apologies. This is Dean Cooper.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Crick, by whom are you employed in what capacity?
I'm employed by Spire as controller
and Chief Accounting Officer of Spire, Missouri.
Have you caused to be prepared for the purposes of this case certain direct, rebuttal, and surrebuttal testimony in question and answer form?
Yes, I have.
Is it your understanding that that testimony has been marked as exhibits 15, 16, and 17 for identification?
Yes.
Do you have any changes that you would like to make to that testimony at this time?
I do have one minor change to my rebuttal on page 6. There's a table or image that was at the top of the page that belonged at the bottom of the page. If a question comes up on that topic, I can point it out for you.
Yeah, so it should have been after which answer?
The one at the bottom of page 6.
Right. So the answer that would start on line 11 and end on line 15.
Correct. Yeah.
If I ask you the questions which are contained in exhibits 15, 16, and 17 today, would your answers as with the one change you noted be the same?
Yes, I would.
Are those answers true and correct to the best of your information, knowledge, and belief?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would offer exhibits 15, 16, and 17 into evidence and tender the witness for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Are there any objections to the admission of exhibits 15, 16, or 17? Hearing none, they are so admitted. The witness has been tendered according to my official list of cross-examination. We go to staff.
Kevin Thompson for staff. Thank you, Your Honor. No questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Next, we go to Office of the Public Counsel.
No questions. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Let me check. I do have questions for you. Mr. Crick, what do you mean in your direct testimony on page 11, lines 22 to 23, and it's restated again in your rebuttal, page 10, lines 23 to 24, when you say, quote, the process and systems used to capitalize overheads has changed in recent years? What did you mean by that statement?
We've enhanced our systems, so we've actually put in some newer systems as part of our Oracle system. So we've actually enhanced the system used to process the allocation. Somewhat as a result of the last case as well too, we knew all parties desired more transparency, so we actually added additional accounts to provide additional transparency.
Thank you. When did those changes occur?
We implemented them at the beginning of fiscal year 20.
Both staff witness Matt Young and OPC witness Bob Schallenberg state that Spire does not maintain the records required under the USOA Gas Plant Section 4 overhead construction costs to support its allocation of cost to capital projects. Staff witness Matt Young states, and I am referring to his rebuttal, page 18, line 8 to 10, quote, furthermore, the only time general and administrative expenses can be capitalized when the incremental cost method is not used is if studies are made to determine a relationship to construction. Spire has provided no such studies, end quote. Do you agree with this statement?
Somewhat. We provide, we use different causal relationships to approximate what a study would provide, or better said, in lieu of what a formal study would provide. And these are the same causal relationships that we've used and updated for my 7 years here, and I suspect decades before that.
Thank you. And has Spire completed the studies that were required by the USOA to determine the relationship between general and administrative costs?
We have not performed formal studies by a third party. We've performed internal studies meant to approximate or provide similar evidence.
Okay. Does Spire require its supervisors to maintain time cards that identify how their time is spent?
They do.
Is Spire STL pipeline regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission?
Yes.
Do you know if Spire STL pipeline is required to follow the FERC USOA?
Yes.
Yes, you know, or yes, it is?
Yes, I know it, the Spire STL pipeline is required to follow the FERC USOA.
Thank you, sorry, lawyers.
Yes.
Do you know who D. Scott Sabert is?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell me?
Sure. He is a peer of mine at the company. He is the vice president of financial planning and analysis and supply chain. He also serves as the chief financial officer of the pipeline and our marketing business.
Okay, I am checking. I do not have any further questions.
Okay.
Not accused. We now go back to recross. So going to my handy list of cross-examination for a Spire witness, we go first to staff.
Kevin Thompson for staff, no questions. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Next, we go to Mr. Kleiser for the Office of the Public Counsel.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you, and we go to redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. I guess for the court reporter, this is Dean Cooper again. Mr. Crick, you were asked questions by Judge Hatcher, starting with how the process has changed over recent years. What is the process that was being referred to?
The process is how we allocate overhead to construction projects.
Yes.
Yes. Can I describe it? Is that what you're asking? So we have a general ledger that maintains, say, each and every detail of every transaction. That could be in the form of an invoice from a third party. That could be a time record of an employee, and that could be a general ledger entry. So within that general ledger, we also have sub-ledgers that maintain additional detail of each and every one of those transactions. We provided the general ledger as part of request to staff and OPC that included every one of those details. We did receive some questions. I heard also that they couldn't conclude. They couldn't do an audit, which with all of the details we provided, I'm puzzled to understand why they couldn't accomplish an audit.
Did you offer to provide additional information?
We did, knowing that there are lots of details associated with this. We went back to staff and offered to provide exactly what they asked for, and we did mention that it would be a heavy lift, and that maybe some type of sampling method would be more appropriate, and that we would follow up after their initial direct was filed. Not, to my knowledge, I don't think there was really any further follow-up.
And when you say there was no follow-up, do you mean by the company or by the staff, or what are you referring to?
From the staff, there was no additional questions to further perform audit activities.
You referenced in response to a bench question the causal relationship. Can you tell me how that causal relationship is established by the company?
One of the primary relationships we use is field direct labor as a percentage of total field labor. That obviously drives a lot of activities in the company as it relates to construction activities. We also have various causal factors within the operation where vehicle usage is one, and other types of overheads that get consumed in the construction process. So we use, again, the direct labor for a lot of our A&G costs, which has been the discussion here, but there's lots of other overheads that we apply with other types of cost drivers, cost causation drivers.
Once that causal relationship is established, how often do you relook it?
Well, we update that causal relationship at least annually in the budgeting process, but when it comes to allocating overheads to capital, it's a monthly process, because we do have, if you had a very warm winter, we may get some construction activities done, and the overheads that support that would then be capitalized. But if we had a very cold winter, very little capital would be done in the winter, and all that would go to O&M. So one of my, in my testimony, I mentioned if we did a study that's more of a static, one-time snapshot of how those overheads support construction. And that's why I feel like our method's appropriate, because it adjusts monthly.
You got a bench question that asked about, I think, required studies, if I heard correctly. Do you necessarily agree that studies are required by the USOA?
If you read it black and white, and I think there's, I feel like this part of the USOA is somewhat vague. There's terms in there, reasonably applicable, equitable proportion, as far as practical. So again, I think a study is one way of doing that, but I also think a reasonable method is to, use a causal relationship such as we have.
I don't have any more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
I believe that wraps us up for this witness. Mr. Crick, you are excused. Mr. Young, for staff, is our next witness. If Mr. Young would make his way to the witness stand. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, sir. Please have a seat and state and spell your name for the court reporter.
Sure. My name is Matthew Young, Matthew Young.
Thank you, Mr. Young, and staff, your witness.
Thank you, Judge. This is Kevin Thompson for staff. Good evening, Mr. Young.
Good evening.
How are you employed?
I am a regulatory auditor for the Missouri Public Service Commission staff.
Are you the same Matthew Young that prepared or caused to be prepared rebuttal testimony marked as Exhibit 125, surrebuttal testimony marked as Exhibit 140, and contributed to staff's revenue requirement cost of service report, both public and confidential, marked as Exhibit 101?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to any of those pieces of testimony?
No.
If I were to ask you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
And are those answers true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, I would offer Exhibits 125 and 140.
Thank you. Are there any objections to Exhibit 125 or Exhibit 140 being admitted onto the hearing record? Hearing no objections, it's so admitted.
I tender the witness for cross-examination.
Thank you, and according to my handy list, we go to Spire.
It seems like we would be after OPC, Your Honor.
I am referring to, it's page 10, and I don't know where it came from. All I took was page 10. But the order of opening statements and order of cross-examination, staff, this seems like it was one of the schedules produced. Maybe one of the very initial schedules. If Spire wants to pass, I'm happy to call on OPC first.
No, we have some questions, but like that, normal sort of practice, I think we would follow Mr. Kleiser on this one.
And is this Mr. Cooper?
It is.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Judge, I'm going to hand to Mr. Young, with your permission, the document that Mr. Kleiser passed out during his opening statement.
Go ahead.
Mr. Young, would you agree that when we talk about capitalized overheads, the base costs that are at issue are costs that were incurred by Spire, Missouri, correct?
Not quite. I think in addition to the costs incurred by Spire, Missouri, there's a litany of costs incurred by or through Spire.
Excuse me, sir. I'm having a hard time understanding what you're saying.
Sure. I said that in addition to the costs incurred by Spire, Missouri, there are also costs that flow through Spire services.
And when you talk about costs that have flowed through Spire services, those costs, as well as the costs that are incurred by Spire, Missouri itself, that's the pool of costs that we're talking about when we start to move towards what should or shouldn't be capitalized as a part of the overheads, correct?
Yes.
And ultimately, the question we're dealing with in this issue is what portion of those costs should be capitalized along with the construction projects as opposed to expensed. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
And what I handed you, well, let me back up. Do you recognize what I handed you?
It appears to be an instruction for of the USOA.
Okay. And I think you quoted this several times in your testimony, but in particular, I think in your rebuttal testimony, you quoted
from A, subpart A, where it talks about the types of overhead construction costs, such as engineering, supervision, general office salaries and expenses, construction engineering, and supervision by others, and onward. Do you remember doing that?
I believe it was my rebuttal. It could be both. Yes, I do.
And again, those types of costs, if not capitalized, you would expect them to be expensed, correct?
Correct.
Now, in this case, we're dealing with amounts that have, overheads that have already been capitalized on Spire Reserve's books, correct?
Correct.
And on a going forward basis, no provision is made in staff's revenue requirement to treat any of the previously capitalized types of expenses as or capitalized amounts as expenses going forward. Is that correct?
That's correct. In my direct testimony, one of my recommendations was for the commission to order an adjustment to reflect their decision on this issue. And that's what I was referring to. Unfortunately, I just don't have a number.
Say that again.
In my direct testimony, one of my recommendations was for an accounting adjustment to reflect the commission's decision. Unfortunately, I just don't have a number.
And by that accounting adjustment, would that be additional expenses that would have been added to the staff's revenue requirement?
Yes.
Now, looking back at that excerpt from instruction 4 that you have in front of you, and still in subpart A, would you agree with me that after that listing of types of overheads, it goes on to state that these shall be charged to particular jobs or units on the basis of the amounts of such overheads reasonably applicable thereto?
Yes.
Now, neither you nor any other staff witness have filed testimony suggesting that the underlying costs that have been capitalized were not prudently incurred, have you?
That's correct.
Again, if we look at our gas plan instruction 4 that's in front of you, and Mr. Kleiser conveniently highlighted this sentence. The last sentence of subpart B states, the addition to direct construction costs of arbitrary percentages or amounts to cover assumed overhead costs is not permitted, correct?
Correct.
So while 4B identifies direct time reporting and special studies as permitted, what it straight out prohibits is the capitalization of arbitrary percentages or amounts, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree with me that a common definition of arbitrary would be not done according to reason or judgment?
That sounds like a good definition.
Now, in your surrebuttal, in your description of Spire Missouri's process, you state that instead of conducting studies of the time charged to clearing accounts by its employees, Spire uses the direct labor charges as the basis of distributing overhead payroll costs, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you further explained that Spire has assumed there is a relationship between how construction employees use their time and how a supervisor's time is used.
Yes, and that's what makes it an arbitrary percentage.
Well, that's my question for you. Doesn't the method used by Spire use reason or judgment? It's just not the reason or judgment that you think they should use?
It's not reasonable to just assume that the supervisors and their supervisors and all the way up to who knows how far up the hierarchy of employees, that their time is dictated by how the time is reported by the field employees.
But let's back up a second. I mean, you're making an assumption as to how this plays out down the road, but at the fundamental level, there is reason or judgment in terms of how Spire Missouri approaches these overheads. The capitalization of overheads, correct?
No, we won't know until we see how the reason was laid out.
I'm sorry, we don't know until we see how the what is laid out?
how the Spire's reasoning was laid out.
Thank you.
Now, just for sort of explanation, I guess, of impacts here, and you and I talked about this at the beginning of the questions, that to the extent capitalized amounts or amounts are not capitalized, they would be expensed, correct?
Correct.
And I think in your portion of the staff report for the cost of service, you kind of explained that to some extent, correct?
I don't recall doing that. It's been a long time.
Okay. Well, let's get at it this way. Would you agree that at a very rough, kind of high level, that the revenue requirement impact of capitalized amounts is about 10%?
That's a good ballpark estimate, yes.
So, for example, if $1 million of overheads are capitalized, all else being equal, you'd expect an increase in revenue requirement of about $100,000.
I don't know about an increase. I'd say it would contribute to the revenue requirement by $100,000.
Okay. On the other hand, well, let me say, if we go the other direction, if we say that $1 million of cost is not capitalized and instead expensed, again, all else being equal, that $1 million would increase the revenue requirement by $1 million, correct?
If you moved the $100 million from rate base to expense, it also affects depreciation expense and rate of return, so it would probably be a net increase of 70 to 80 million. If you moved it from rate base to expense.
Well, I only paused because we kind of ended up starting from a different number, I think, in our hypotheticals. But your hypothetical was working with $100 million coming out of rate base and going into expense, correct?
Correct.
And so you would expect that you'd have some offsets, but you think that would still impact revenue requirement by 70 to 80 million, correct?
Yes, there would be no doubt there's a short-term increase of some amount.
And again, if we go back to my first example, if we said 100 million in rate base, what would you expect the revenue requirement impact to be? And we've talked about 10%, it would only be 100. Now I've got myself confused. 10 million in that example, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, in your survey testimony, you cite to a NARUC interpretation of the USOA for electric and gas utilities, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And you attach that, in fact, as a schedule to your survey?
Yes.
Now, the USOA applicable to Spire, Missouri the USOA applicable to Spire, Missouri is created by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, correct?
That's right.
And not NARUC.
Correct.
And the NARUC interpretation you provide is dated September of 1988, correct?
That's correct.
Is that the most recent interpretation of the FERC electric and gas USOA that NARUC has published?
As far as I'm aware, that's the only interpretation.
Excuse
And
me,
in
Mr.
fact,
Cooper, what is that name you're using?
NARUC, N-A-R-U-C.
Thank you.
And in fact, that 1988 interpretation would predate the version of the FERC USOA that's utilized by this commission, correct?
That's probably correct, but I think the language is identical.
Is there a reason that this 1988 NARUC interpretation has not been relied on by the staff over the last 32 plus years?
I'm not aware of the time that it has been brought forth as an issue to be considered.
It's been there since 1988, but tell me again what your response is.
My response is I'm not aware of any case since 1988 where the interpretation of gas plant instructions 3 and 4 has been considered in a rate case.
Now, I think as a consequence of the staff position, and this is in your testimony, staff recommends that the commission should order Spire to cease capitalizing non-operational overhead costs, or as an alternative, order Spire to cease capitalizing costs received from Spire services until such time that Spire can demonstrate its compliance with the USOA. Is that accurate?
Yes.
In staff's proposal, who's going to decide that Spire has demonstrated its compliance?
Well, I had envisioned that Spire and staff and public counsel would cooperate and provide status reports to the commission and decide how to implement that in Spire's general rate cases.
So you would envision that none of these amounts would be returned to being capitalized as overheads until the next rate case?
Well, the problem is, what we don't want is a large adjustment to expense to charge ratepayers as a result of this case. And then in between rate cases, Spire is allowed to put those costs into rate base and not expense them. And so I guess there's got to be some consideration of what ratepayers are paying.
So tell me how that would work between cases. Are you proposing that there be a regulatory asset that would hold those costs in between rate cases?
I don't think so. I think you quantify what we're putting into rates in the current case and make a best effort not to double recover from ratepayers.
Did you say make a best effort to not?
Double recover from ratepayers.
Thank you.
What are you going to do if at the end of this process, it's determined that, well, I guess I'm struggling with how this is going to play out in that next rate case. So are you going to go back and pick up some of these expenses that should have been paid by the ratepayers in the next rate case?
No, I think if we put it in expense, ratepayers will have paid it, so there is no cost.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to start over with your answer. It's getting kind of muddled.
No problem.
Thank you.
Move the microphone really close to your mouth. I think that's the issue.
So I think my answer was that the costs that are charged to ratepayers will be charged to ratepayers, and there won't be a pool of costs that should have been charged. And in the next rate case, we'll have some work done about how Spire is compliant with the USOA.
But in the meantime, aren't you holding back some amount of cost that Spire Missouri would have otherwise capitalized?
If there is a mismatch, it's just because I can't quantify the overheads. And it will depend on what the commission orders.
We talked about this a little earlier, but is a special study, or I guess a series of special studies, one of the ways you would envision Spire would demonstrate its compliance with the USOA?
I think what staff has been looking for is just the rationale and the basis of how overheads are sent to capital. And however that looks, whether it's a special study by a third party or whether it's a formal documentation, I don't know.
That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Remind me where we are at. Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. Go ahead.
I'm going to try and keep mine as short as possible. Good evening, Mr. Cooper. Good evening. You have a copy of your testimony?
Good evening.
Young.
Mr. Young, I do apologize.
It is late.
You have a copy of your survey in front of you? I do. You go to page 19.
I'm there.
I'm going to attempt to paraphrase lines 14 through 18, and feel free to correct me, but would you agree that you're effectively saying the Spire does not keep sufficient records regarding the tabulation of overhead costs due to complete your audit?
Yes, in multiple data requests, in an attempt to, evaluate USOA's instruction, gas plant construction number 4, paragraph C, where overhead construction costs shall be kept to show each overhead, the nature and amount charged to each work order and each plant account and the basis of distribution. And so in the server bubble that you asked about, Spire has not been able to provide anything and satisfy that instruction.
Do you have a copy of Mr. Schallenberg's direct?
Yes.
Could you go to page 25 of the direct? Your Honor, I would note that Mr. Schallenberg's direct was filed confidential in its entirety. I'm going to scope this question in a manner that hopefully does not touch on any confidentiality, nor do I think confidentiality would be an issue for what we're discussing with regard to my questions right now. Just putting you on notice of that fact. So can you read lines 22 through line 5 of the next page to yourself? You don't have to read it out loud, just read it to yourself. Okay. Would you agree that that recommendation would at least help to alleviate the problems you identified at page 19 of your survey rebuttal that I asked you about previously?
I agree, that would help.
That would help. Mr. Young, I really want to call you something different. I apologize. Mr. Young, do you know for certain right now the amounts currently being booked as expense overheads and being collected in base rates are not going to be further capitalized to ISRIS projects in the future?
Ooh, I don't know. I wouldn't have a guess about ISRIS projects. I know Mr. Schallenberg's directs, well, on that page you directed me to, it quotes $173 million for the overheads that are being capitalized. I believe Mr. Crick's rebuttals, it states $87 million of overheads are being capitalized before an income tax factor up, which I don't think is applicable. But the answer is no. The amounts are confusing.
Maybe I didn't phrase that question correctly. I'm not asking about the amount. I'm asking about whether or not you can say for certain right now that whatever is being capitalized and expensed in overheads will not be further, excuse myself. Can you say for certain right now that whatever is being expensed to overheads currently and included in base rates will not be further capitalized in a future ISRIS project?
I don't know. I can't say for certain, you know, the level of expense. I guess the level of overhead changes every year, and there's a lot of moving pieces.
What was the end of that? There's a lot of what?
A lot of moving pieces.
Thank you.
On that same page 25 of Mr. Schellenberg's direct, lines 19 through 21, he proposes a tracker. Now, I know that you have voiced opposition to this tracker. My question is, would that tracker at least make it more likely that it is possible to determine whether amounts currently being booked as an expense as overheads are being capitalized to ISRIS projects in the future?
I just don't know how it would work.
Fair enough. I believe that was all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. We'll now turn to bench questions. I'll ask the commissioners first. Do any commissioners have any questions for Mr. Young? Okay, hearing none. The judge does have a few questions. First, Mr. Young, do you know if the Missouri PSC has adopted the FERC Form 2, and that's spelled F-E-R-C? Has the Missouri PSC adopted the FERC Form 2 as the annual report required to be submitted by its gas-regulated entity?
I believe it has.
Mr. Young, do you know if the parties were provided a copy of the 2020 annual report submitted by Spire STL Pipeline with FERC during this case?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you. In your surrebuttal testimony, page 16, lines 13 to 16, you state, quote, Spire comes to the conclusion that costs are not unique in nature and are equally eligible for capitalization. For example, Spire applies the same capital transfer rate to injuries and damages insurance, nearly the entire office supplies account, and directors and officers insurance, despite the varying relationship of those costs to construction, end quote. What is the capital transfer rate Spire applied to injuries and damages insurance, comma, office supplies, comma, and directors and officers insurance?
I can't recall the percentage itself. I believe it would have been the three-factor general allocator.
Without Spire completing a study of supervisor time card distributions, would there be any way to determine an appropriate capital transfer rate based on the requirements of the USOA?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of that question?
Without Spire completing a study of supervisor time card distributions, would there be any way, without that, to determine an appropriate capital transfer rate based on the requirements of the USOA?
think they would have to look at the time cards of their employees and come to some sort of documented conclusion to apply a transfer rate.
I'm hearing you answer in the negative, but I'm not hearing you say no. So I'm going to ask the question, without Spire completing a study of the supervisor time card distributions, would there be any way to determine an appropriate capital transfer rate based on the USOA requirements?
Off the top of my head, no, I can't think of any way, based on USOA language, they could do that.
Thank you. Could staff have performed its own Spire supervisor time report to determine an overhead capitalization rate that would comply with the USOA?
No.
In your rebuttal testimony, page 5, lines 7 to 10, you state, let me tell you the question first. I'm going to explain what I'm going to ask for you to explain what you mean by non-operational overhead. Here's the quote. For everyone else, I'm looking at page rebuttal, page 5, lines 7 to 10. Quote, staff recommended that, comma, on a going forward basis, comma, the commission should order Spire to cease capitalizing non-operational overhead costs, comma, or as an alternative, order Spire to cease capitalizing costs received from Spire services, comma, until such a time that Spire can demonstrate its compliance with the USOA. So I ask you in the middle of that quote, please explain what you meant by non-operational overhead costs.
When I came up with the term non-operational overhead costs, I was referencing, and I should have done it in testimony, I was referencing the direct testimony of Mr. Crick in case numbers GO-2019-0356 and GO-2019-0357. On page 6 of his testimony, he breaks down capital costs into direct charges, operational overheads, and non-operational overheads, and those are described as employee benefits, shared service, and administrative and general costs.
I want to make sure I have that straight. The report and order that we took notice of, and only took notice of the report and order, are you stating that you got that phrase and definition non-operational overhead costs from Mr. Crick of Spire's testimony from a different case?
That's correct, but basically, non-operational overhead costs are indirect costs charged to construction that are not related to field work. That's what I had envisioned when I used that term.
Just for my education, not related to field work, are we then talking about the office workers that somehow participate? I'm talking about architects, lawyers, city planners.
Sorry to interrupt. All the things that Spire charges to construction, such as the engineering, the corporate engineering function, the new growth support, and there's several others. But yes, the corporate type costs.
Okay. How, in general, would the amount of non-operational overhead differ from cost capitalized from Spire services?
Spire services costs are embedded in the non-operational overhead costs. So Spire services costs, and if I understand it correctly, are a subset of non-operational costs.
Okay. And let me pause here. Sherry, if you could unmute and let me know how you are doing if you need a break. I think we might be at least another 30 minutes, give or take.
I can go that long without a break.
Okay, let's proceed.
Thank you.
Mr. Young, I've got 2 more questions. In the direct testimony of OPC Robert Schallenberg, Schedule RES-D-4, it is stated that the test year overheads of Spire, Missouri East and West combined to a total of $172 million, and I'm rounded number. The schedule lists different types of overhead and the amount of each type of overhead for East and West separately. If the commission were to order Spire to cease capitalizing non-operational overhead costs, would that eliminate all of the overhead types that appear on Schallenberg's direct schedule RES-D-4? Or are the non-operational overheads only a part of the $172.8 million total?
Unfortunately, I didn't bring Mr. Schallenberg's schedules, so I don't recall exactly what that list looks like. It seems like if the commission were to order all those costs stop going to capital, that if I remember the schedule, it would be almost the entire list.
Okay. I believe this is the last question for me. What information would Spire need to provide to the staff or staff to be able to audit Spire, Missouri's capitalized overhead costs and to determine if Spire were in compliance with the USOA?
If Spire were to be able to provide some record of its plant accounts that displays the nature and amount of each overhead, which Spire has not been able to provide, it's not in the general ledger, then that would be a good start, and then we could move on to, if we knew the nature and quantity, we could move on to the basis of the relationship to construction.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Before I tender the witness, I am going to take official notice of the Spire, Missouri East and West annual report submitted to the Missouri Public Service Commission for 2020. Where are we at? This leads to some recross. Let's check our official list. For staff witnesses, my apologies, Mr. Cooper. Would you like to go first, or shall I call it over?
Are my choices first or not at all?
No, I'll let you go last.
Really? I'll go last.
Mr. Kleiser.
No further questions.
Okay. And Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Young, the judge asked you a question as to what types of things would need to be supplied, correct?
Correct.
And do you remember, did you have an email exchange with Mr. Sellinger of Spire, Missouri, in regard to information that might be available and different types of information that the company might be able to provide?
I remember that, yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to mark an exhibit if I could.
You're going to be introducing that to be offered onto the record?
I am, yes.
Okay.
I believe exhibit 46, Your Honor, if that's consistent with your record.
Exhibit 46.
Yes, you want to stack them or just want to have stacks?
Thank you.
Mr. Young, you let me know when, you've had a chance to look at Exhibit 46.
Okay.
Do you recognize that to be, an exchange, email exchange you had with Mr. Sellinger of Spire, Missouri?
Yes, it is.
And Mr. Sellinger had offered, some different ways to get at the underlying information, correct?
He offered what he could offer.
And as of May 4th, you had suggested that perhaps everyone could come back to that after staff's filing, correct?
I did.
Did you ever go back to that after staff's filing?
No, at this point, it was clear that Spire couldn't provide, overheads by cost element in its plan accounts.
And so you never went back to see what Mr. Sellinger had offered or could provide in that regard?
No, he said it would require a lot of, labor, call it a big lift, and I didn't want him to go through all the exercise to provide a bunch of data that wasn't going to help my audit.
So you never requested that big lift, correct?
Correct.
There was mention in one of the judges, well, let me back up. Judge, I would offer Exhibit 46.
These are the emails that were just passed out. Does any party have any objection to the admission of Exhibit 46 onto the hearing record? Mr. Kaiser.
I would well, to what extent is it being offered? Because my objection is hearsay unless it's only being offered to the extent to prove the statement by Mr. Young. Mr. Sellinger's statements are hearsay. So I think Mr. Young has authenticated this as a conversation he had with a representative of the company. And so I think it comes in for whatever way the commission chooses to provide it. I would offer that if it's being introduced, if the commission is only accepting the portions that Mr. Young replies, then it would be a statement of the witness.
The commissioners are very aware of the hearsay rule, and I will let them take this under their hat to determine its weight. Objection is overruled. The exhibit is admitted onto the record.
Mr. Young, one of the judge's questions, I think, referred to a three-factor test in terms of the assignment of certain costs to capitalized overheads. Is the three-factor test really applicable to the assignment or the establishment of capitalized overheads, or is that a term that would normally be utilized in regard to corporate allocations?
That's correct. It's more in terms of sending costs between affiliates.
I'm sorry, I heard that's correct, and then it was very muffled.
That's correct. It is more applicable to distributing costs to affiliates.
again, there were some questions about what you meant by non-operational costs that came from the bench. And that was referenced back to your staff's recommendation that the capitalization of those costs be ceased. Again, no matter what constitutes those costs or what amount they're in, there is no provision made in staff's case for treating those costs as expenses and the alternative to capitalizing them as a part of the overheads, correct?
That's right.
That's all the questions I have here.
And we come to redirect.
Thank you, Judge. So, picking up with the question that Mr. Cooper just asked, you never suggested that any costs that had already been booked to overheads be instead shifted to expense, did you?
That's all right. I'm having a hard time hearing the last part of that.
Oh, I'm
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear after overheads.
I don't know what I was saying anyway. Let me try again. This is Kevin Thompson for staff.
Thank you.
Your recommendation was for a change in practice going forward. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And did you envision any amount that had already been capitalized being instead expensed?
No, I did not.
So this wasn't going to be a financial disaster?
No, I didn't make any disallowance to Spire's cost of service.
Now, with respect to Exhibit 46, do you have that up there?
Was that the email? Or
That was the email.
Okay.
Take a look at page 2, and in the middle, do you see there's an email from you dated April 29th?
Yes.
And the second paragraph there, or maybe it's the third, anyway, there's a mention of a spreadsheet. Do you see that?
I do.
It says a spreadsheet similar to what we look at in the ISRIS cases.
Yes.
Did you ever get a spreadsheet like that?
Mr. Selinger offered it, but that was what he would call a heavy lift to reference to support the entire rate base.
To support the entire, did you say rate base at the end?
Rate.
Thank you.
I'm looking, Judge. There are a lot of questions to go through. What about a tracker, Mr. Young? You were asked about OPC's tracker suggestion. Is that something that you're in favor of?
No, as I addressed in my rebuttal testimony, not only would a tracker, I don't know how we could mechanically implement it. I don't know if overhead costs are they qualify for the Commission's usual standards on what to be tracked and not tracked.
And with respect to the excerpt from the Uniform System of Accounts, do you have that there?
Yes.
And looking at paragraph C, is it your professional opinion that Spire complied with paragraph C?
My opinion is that it did not comply with paragraph C.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I believe that will lead us to conclude Mr. Young's testimony. You are excused, sir. Thank you. As Mr. Schallenberg makes his way to the stand, I would like to pass on a request to the council for Spire. The commission would like to see a copy of the Spire STL Pipeline 2020 FERC Form 2 Annual Report as an exhibit. Okay, request is passed on. Mr. Schallenberg, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Please have a seat. Pull the microphone very close to your mouth and state and spell your last name for our court reporter.
Robert E. Schallenberg, Schallenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Schallenberg. And this will be our final witness for today. We will be adjourning after this witness. It is public counsel's witness. Mr. Kleiser, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Schallenberg, by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am employed by the Office of the Public Counsel, and my job title is Director of Policy.
And did you cause to be prepared?
I'm sorry, was that Director of Policy?
Yes,
Thank you.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared direct testimony, rebuttal testimony, and surrebuttal testimony for this hearing?
yes,
We also receive an order from the commission to correct your rebuttal testimony to add page numbers.
yes,
We file a corrected version of your testimony with page numbers.
yes,
Regarding the direct testimony, corrected rebuttal testimony, and surrebuttal testimony, do you have any changes you would like to make?
no,
I ask you the same questions that were posed in those testimonies today. Would your answer be the same or substantially similar?
yes,
I would offer 203C, 204P, 204C, and 205C, which are respectively the direct testimony, corrected rebuttal testimony public, corrected rebuttal testimony confidential, and surrebuttal testimony from Mr. Schallenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. I will not repeat the list. You all heard the exhibits. Are there any objections to the admission of Mr. Schallenberg's various testimonies? Seeing no objection, it is so admitted.
Your Honor, I would note that we initially filed the rebuttal and surrebuttal testimony as confidential in their entirety. This was a precautionary measure because we felt like we were fighting for a large amount of confidential information. If the commission would the OPC does not claim any of the information filed as confidential. It's being claimed as confidential by Spire. If the commission would so like, we can let Spire determine if there's any portions of it that they don't consider confidential, and we may be able to file public. I offer that to both Spire and the commission. Otherwise, we are prepared to stand on them being completely confidential. Obviously, no reason to make a decision right now if necessary. I'm just throwing that out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll take that under advisement, and I'll let you guys and ladies talk about that amongst yourselves. Just for future reference, that's probably the better method, just so we don't have to worry about the confidential on testimony. But I appreciate your going the extra mile to protect the company.
With that, I tender the witness for cross.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiser. Going to my order of cross-examination for an OPC witness. Skipping those that have been excused, we come to staff.
Thank you, Judge. This is Kevin Thompson for staff. I have no questions of this witness at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And for Spire.
This is Dean Cooper. We have no questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. That brings us to bench questions. Are there any questions from the commissioners? And again, to unmute, it is *6 if you're on your phone. Hearing no questions, the judge has a handful of questions. Mr. Schellenberg, OPC raised the capitalization of overheads issue in Spire, Missouri's ISRIS cases. That's GR-2019-0356 and 0357. Those ISRIS cases included plant placed in service between February 1, 2019 and May 31st, 2019. Your direct testimony schedule, RES-D-4, includes capitalized overheads for the test year, October 1, 2019 through September 30th, 2020 only. Is that correct?
I can't say I recall that with enough detail, but it sounds correct, but I don't have that kind of memory in that case.
I think this is referring to your testimony in this case, your current schedule, RES-D-4. I believe what are the dates that your schedule RES-D-4 covers? What is the time period?
October 1st of 2019 through September 30th of 2020.
All right, thank you. Does the test year in this rate case cover the Spire fiscal year reported in its 2020 annual report to the Missouri Public Service Commission? Does the test year in this rate case, cover Spire's fiscal year, which was reported in its 2020 annual report?
That is the test year, and the fiscal year match. I believe their annual report matches on a fiscal year basis as well. But I know some of those reports come out on a calendar year basis. I'm not 100%, but I would say from my recollection, the annual report is on a fiscal year basis too.
Thank you. And do you plan to update the overhead amounts in your direct testimony? And again, this is schedule RES-D-4. Do you plan to update that schedule to include plant placed into service through May 31st, 2021?
I'd say I don't know.
Other than labor and materials directly assigned to a capital project, is there any way, based upon the information provided by Spire, to determine if any of the overhead allocations to the capital projects are in compliance with the USOA?
I'd say if you want to play it by the precision and say, do they have that kind of detail supporting all their overheads? The answer is no. If you go back and look at, they use a lot of overheads that are labor-based, and it's fairly, you can make the assumption that those overheads would be impacted by construction labor. So, and some of the, I think there's 10 overhead categories. Some of those categories clearly are labor-oriented. And so, in fact, I don't
I'm not challenging those types of overheads are being capitalized at the time now. There is a risk in that there is some misallocation, but I'm not doing that in this case.
I believe I have just a couple more questions. Do you know the total value of the test year plant additions included in rate base associated with the $172.8 million of total overheads you listed on the same schedule we've been talking about, DES-D-4?
As I recall, the number is a calendar number of how much was capitalized over a 12-month period, over a year. And so the plant balance is a moving balance during the year as different levels of construction materialize. That would vary by month. So there would not be, on a year of capitalization of overhead, there wouldn't be one fixed plant balance. It would be constantly moving during the year.
This is for my edification again. So we couldn't come up with one single number that would say this is the plant additions undertaken by Spire during the test year?
Yes, for example, January, a certain amount of overheads would be capitalized based on January's activity. Then when you get to February overheads will be based on February activity. And some of those projects get completed, so they're no longer subject to capitalization. So the number that you're dealing with in a year where you say this is how much overhead you capitalize, that's a cumulative balance of all the fluctuating construction balances you had throughout the year.
Okay. Would you agree that any tracking of overheads ordered in this rate case prospectively would not provide for any adjustment to capitalized overheads included in plant in this rate case?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was thinking through that myself. Would you agree that any tracking of overheads ordered in this rate case prospectively would not provide for any adjustment to the capitalized overheads included in plant in this rate case?
I'd have to say it depends on how you design that tracker. It could or it couldn't, depending if you designed it one way or the other.
Let me think through this out loud maybe for just a second. Mr. Kleiser was bringing up the point that the recommendation by staff in non-term of art language is we're going to leave alone the capital overheads that exist. And going forward, we're going to have a tracker or have a new system or have an order. What I think the question is getting at is that point in time when we switch, if the commission switches. A tracker is not going to go back in time to do anything to these other capitalized overheads unless they're unfinished? Is that?
No, in fact, if that's the case of what you're talking about, the tracker can only track what it was for the time period it was on.
Okay.
And it isn't designed, I mean, you'd have to do a special study to get to, and the tracker isn't going to be designed to tell you how much it was last year or the next couple of years. It's only only gonna track when you put it in effect.
Thank you. That is all the questions I have. Let's go back to recross, checking my handy lists. We come to staff.
Thank you, Judge. Kevin Thompson for staff, no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Next, we have Spire for recross.
Just a moment, Your Honor. No question, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And redirect, Mr. Kleiser.
Hopefully keep this very brief. Bob, you were asked a question about how to tell whether or not something's in compliance. You had responded in part talking about you weren't challenging all overheads. So just to try and clarify, what is your recommendation regarding overheads?
At this time, the overheads that the practice that should be discontinued is the one that's called the general overhead, which is based on a construction labor ratio, I think, total.
So it's not all overheads, just general overheads?
No, the overheads like for pensions and payroll taxes and those things, they might not be right, but I haven't studied them enough, and there is a general acceptance that would be a capitalized cost. General overheads is the area you have the most trouble with in terms of being that they're compliant or not, and that's where my focus is in this case.
The only other question was related to this fiscal year timing issue, and maybe I was confused, but is Spire's current test year coincide with their fiscal year?
With the 2020 fiscal year, we're now in a different fiscal year.
Do they match up?
The test year and fiscal year ending September 30, 2020, they match.
Okay. That was it.
Thank you. Mr. Schallenberg, you are dismissed from the witness stand. Before we dismiss for the day, I want to go over just a couple things. Tomorrow morning, we are going to start at 9 a.m. It will be the same and new WebEx number that was sent out this afternoon, if you prefer to join by WebEx. Tomorrow, and likely for the remainder of the hearing, the live stream, this is not the WebEx, this is the live stream that shows on the PSC website, will not have video. It will be just like a local public hearing that we have had with this case and with others in the last year. It will have the full audio, including the WebEx audio, but will only show a still picture of the courtroom. Nobody on WebEx will be on the broadcast, and we won't have it. They'll be able to see each other, though. That is all the announcements I have. Are there any other announcements or closing business before I recess? Excellent. Sherry, thank you very much. You have done an excellent job in very difficult circumstances. We are recessed until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Judge Hatcher.
I understand.